also the fact that this is from the Sun, known rag is a bit dubious, but we can take a look at it, I guess.
We are against is the what we are against is the teaching of contested political ideas as if they are accepted fact. We don't do this with communism, we don't do this with socialism, we don't do it with capitalism. And I want to speak.
What? Like, okay, we're already 13 minutes in. Yeah, we we don't teach what communism or socialism is. Now, look, maybe things are different over in bloody old England, right? Maybe things are a bit different, like what they teach over there. But like kids in schools in the United States don't actually learn what socialism is, or what Marxism is, or what communism is. Like these are different ideologies that mean different, like very different things. Um, Instead, we just are taught what capitalism is, and that anything that's not capitalism is just kind of silly and like pie in the sky idealism, right? Like that's what kids in the United States are taught. Um, and I also just need to say that like critical race theory isn't generally taught in like public schools. Like I didn't learn critical race theory until I was in college. Like I was in advanced college level high school courses um for English and history and economics. We didn't learn anything important about socialism or communism in advanced economics. We didn't learn anything about that in really in our history courses. We didn't learn any of that. We didn't learn any critical race theory in our advanced English courses. It wasn't until I was in like my senior year of college that I really started engaging with those ideas. Um, these are, to coin a phrase from the very respected and big-brained Dave Rubin, high-level ideas. Uh, um, so also, I just want you to understand that critical race theory is not a really complicated idea. Simply, it is recognizing that historically our societies have been shaped by dominant white supremacy. And what critical race theory does is it helps us to shift our perspective to what marginalized groups, based on their race, have experienced throughout history and culture. So, what it does is it helps us understand minorities within our larger society better by, like, for example, promoting artistic works by minority artists or writers or philosophers, stuff like that, because typically those have been underemphasized in education. Um, or teaching history from a different perspective, because for example what you'll find in a lot of conservative circles is that conservatives will talk about how great America is and like the amazing forward thinkingness of history. um but if you think of it from any perspective that is not that of a white male, living in the United States really, really, really sucked if you were a Native American, if you were black, for literally hundreds of years. And to some extent, it still sucks. So, like, examining history from these different perspectives is really important to understand the marginalization these groups face, and also to understand how we might have a better path forward. That's the value in critical race theory, by the way. It's helping us to build better systems. It's helping to make us aware of these inequities that exist in our current society.
about a dangerous trend in race relations that has come far too close to home to my life, and it is the promotion of critical race theory, an ideology that sees my blackness as victimhood and their whiteness as oppression.
Now, this is a gross simplification. The issue is not inherently someone's skin color. The issue is that largely, in a lot of places in the world, not just in the United States, that there are systems that were designed for and by white people that white people have historically had advantages in. So, for example, one of the issues is that the African slave trade promoted like the trading of slaves and the abolishment of the confiscation of their property, and they were then denied ownership of property. And under a Western system, if you were denied ownership of property, you are not able to build wealth. And if you're not able to build wealth and you exist in a capitalist system and you're suddenly freed without any wealth, you are in a state of poverty and you are more likely to die poor. And the exact opposite is true. If you're born rich, if you have riches, if you have any amount of wealth, you're more likely to die close to that amount of wealth. So rich people stay rich, poor people stay poor. That's basically how a lot of like capitalist wealth perpetuates itself over time. So the issue isn't necessarily skin color. It's just that systems were designed initially to benefit white people, and then over time, the issue is that the differences between people based on race became ingrained in issues of class and other kinds of social divides. So by having these systems that were based on race, even if all of those systems have been addressed so far, the differentiation based on class will still continue to exist unless there is some redress, which around the world we haven't seen a whole lot of. So the issue is not her being black and being inherently discriminated against, though I would argue that we still live in a fairly racist world in which she at some point has experienced discrimination. But to pretend as if the historical record is not littered with the way white people have kept black people out of certain businesses, out of certain areas of town, out of out of the circles of power and decision making, is to ignore a long history that has played into people's biases and perceptions, and those biases still exist today.
I want to be absolutely clear. This government stands unequivocally against critical race theory. Some schools have decided to openly support the anti-capitalist Black Lives Matter group, often fully aware that...
Now, Black Lives Matter is, to some extent, anti-capitalist. But you know why it's anti-capitalist? For the reasons I just discussed. For example, in parts of the United States, I know specifically in Chicago, Black families have 1/40th the amount of wealth of white families. 1/40th. 1/40th. Multiply that wealth by 40 times the average amount of wealth a black family has. So, do you think that historical class-based inequity might have something to do with how black people around the world think about and interact with the systems of capitalism when they are routinely part of the exploited working class? Do you think that might have something to do with that? I think so. I think, for example, that the black working class can be some of the greatest allies we have as leftists. So maybe that's a reason why Black Lives Matter is anti-capitalist, and maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe they should be anti-capitalist.
They have a statutory duty to be politically impartial. Black lives do matter, of course they do. But we know that the Black Lives Matter movement, capital BLM, is political. I know this because at the height of the protest,
Well, yeah, of course it's political. Like, the entire point of the movement isn't just to like tell you that Black Lives Matter because you don't like it's not like a personal message. It's a call to make society more equitable. It's really not that complicated. Um to my understanding, the American dream means that everyone can make it and get a college/university education for their kids. But I feel in the US, you don't have the chance to get your kids to college and university if you don't have a job that pays 120K a year. Yeah, exactly. Like the American dream is a propaganda tool in order to push the idea that you should be working and scrimping and saving and trying to make it because your ticket out of a working class life is to send your kids or you personally go to college. Like that's the entire American dream, is to scrimp and save and suffer and work until you have the ability to get an education. And then that education is supposed to be able to open doors to you. However, increasingly, just having that college education isn't enough to actually make a like a decent living. It's just not anymore. So like the American dream is largely a propaganda tool, and it's a situation that increasingly seems as if it is not coming back. Um, and I would argue also, as Boss very kindly points out, that it's true. Black people do become slightly richer every year under capitalism. However, I believe that under a socialist state, black people, especially a market a market socialist system, black people could become even more wealthy because they don't have to spend all of their money on subsistence living and could instead pursue mastery and attainment in various other fields that they are passionate about. We could instead be switching over to robots in fast food restaurants, and while still providing for we could still be providing for the decommodification of basic needs. If we did that, that would disproportionately help black folk. And I think that that is actually a really, really good thing that would make people more money. I would actually, boss, we actually just spent a large chunk of time going over how racial bias in the United States costs us literally millions of jobs every year and trillions of dollars over a period of time. Um, and I would argue that the issue in South Africa isn't a socialist state because in no way have I ever read that South Africa has ever adopted socialist policies. I believe it's a capitalist country and has always been a capitalist country. But I would also argue that they are suffering because South Africa also had an apartheid state. And the racism there is very deeply ingrained and probably also costs them a great deal of money to their economy. It feels wrong when some Americans talk about the American dream where everyone can make it, but from where I come from, a jobless single mom can get their kid to university without it costing anything to her. Man, I wish I came from where you are because my parents had to literally work like insane hours in order to get me through college. And I love them to death for that sacrifice, but it shouldn't be necessary in the United States. Again, the United States, wealthiest country on the entire face of the planet, shouldn't be necessary. People should just be able to go to college. Education should be decommodified. Healthcare should be decommodified. Housing should be decommodified. Electricity, water, food, internet, all of those things should be decommodified for us to live in a truly equitable and caring world, I think. I think that that would improve the world exponentially. And in a lot of those cases, if we did decommodify those things, those are actually net benefits to our economy. It's true. It's true. Housing homeless people saves us money. It just does. We could be saving money, but it goes against a lot of people's gut feeling that homeless people should suffer because they're poor. All right, continuing on with this train wreck of a video, where she is somehow under the impression that Black Lives Matter isn't political or is masquerading as a non-political organization, despite the fact that it very clearly has political aims of, like, you know, enfranchising black folk and improving the quality of life for black people and ensuring that, like, police aren't, like, disproportionately policing black people and imprisoning them and perpetuating, like, systemic racism against them. Like, guys, this should be painfully obvious that this is, like, a really dead brain take, okay?
I've been told of white Black Lives Matters protesters calling, and I'm afraid I apologize for saying this word, calling a black armed police officer guarding Downing Street a That is why we do not endorse that movement. That is why we do not want police officer guarding Downing Street
I don't know what she was saying. Also, it's generally not illegal to say mean words to cops. Generally not. However, the unwritten law across the entire world is that the number one thing you can do that is super secret illegal is disrespecting a police officer.
That is why we do not endorse that movement on this side of the House. It is a political movement, and what would be nice would be for members on the opposite side to condemn.
Yeah, it is a political movement. That is true. And it has been true since the beginning. Do you think that, like, they were just marching just 'cause? Like, come on.
Many of the actions that we see this political movement, instead of pretending that it is a completely wholesome anti-racist organization, there is a lot of pernicious stuff that is being pushed, and we stand against that. We do not want to see teachers teaching their white pupils about white privilege and inherited racial guilt.
Yeah, how dare people be taught that white people benefit from having white skin in society? Again, we just went over an article that states if the United States could solve racial bias, we would be making literally like $650 billion more per year as an economy. And we could literally grow by $5 trillion over the next 5 years. And also add like 6 million jobs every year. You can't pretend that this if systemic racism is a thing, which it is, that means that white privilege exists because you're keeping certain people alienated and out of certain fields, which means that you're prioritizing white men generally for those positions. Like that's how it works. Oh, is it against the law to hurl racist insults at others in the UK? Okay, I'll have to assume that whatever she said was a racist insult. I don't know what she said, but also don't break the law. I don't advocate for breaking the law here. So if it's illegal in the UK, don't do that. And also, we should be winning our movement with peaceful action and organized protest, and being kind, I think.
And let me be clear, any school which teaches...
Also, you shouldn't have white guilt. That's not something you should have. I do agree. White guilt shouldn't be taught in schools. However, white people should be aware of their privilege when it comes to, operating in historically white-oriented systems.
These elements of critical race theory as fact, or which promotes partisan political views such as defunding the police without offering a balanced treatment of opposing views.
So, again, defunding the police doesn't mean eliminating the police department. It means taking some of the funds we use for policing, which I need to remind you, policing is largely reactionary. Adding more police on the streets does not prevent crime. It merely adds more people to respond to crimes. So that doesn't necessarily solve the problem. So what defunding the police actually means is moving some of the funds from police, aka some of the funds from reacting to crime, to programs that prevent crime altogether. And by preventing crime, we're not talking about some Minority Report precog system. We're talking about, like, social workers, people who help the poor and the desperate and help them get out of their desperate financial situations. Because often that is what is driving people to do crime, because they are in desperate situations and need money for whatever reason. Also, that's often what drives people to do drugs, because they feel hopeless. Excuse me. They feel hopeless. And they turn to drug use or alcohol abuse, and that further spirals their lives. So, like, yeah, I also will get to the fact, like what she talked about just right here about how overwhelmingly Black Lives Matter is like a violent, hateful organization. We'll get to that.
The law.
All right. You know what? Props to Wagonator for sending us a video that was just blatantly wrong, but very fun to go over in detail, okay? I appreciated that. However, I do need to state that we're not done with this segment yet. We're not done with it yet. All right. Where did it go? Here we go. Oh, wait. Where is it? Where did he put it? Where is it? Bring me the PragerU video. There we go. It's PragerU video time, folks. You know what that means. We're about to strap yourselves in for a really bad take, okay? Or as PragerU puts it, Friday comedy, okay? Do 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 do. All right.
Have had any.
All right. I watched a few seconds of it just to get a feel for what this video is going to be like. So if you've been paying attention, a little while ago, Michelle Obama made a statement about Black Lives Matter, and PragerU has decided to use this to show the hypocrisy of Black Lives Matter supporters and the Democratic Party, the demo rats, as I like to call them. And they are just being very hypocritical and not telling the truth about this very violent and very hateful movement, okay? That's the line that PragerU has. So let's dive into it and see how this goes, okay? Are we ready? Are we ready? All right. If America is so racist, why is it that over 50% of the world's immigrants are trying to come here? Well, partially, boss, because there's a selection bias that happens where rich people from other countries want to come to the United States, because if you're rich in the United States and a minority, you're gonna get treated relatively well. So it's not that big of a mystery, okay? If you have money in the US, you can live a very free life. If you don't have money, life's gonna suck for you, in a big way, okay? So let's look at the are protests mostly peaceful? Turn off annotations because fuck those. All right, let's take a look.
They're stoking fears about Black and brown Americans, lying about how minorities.
I do need to tell you, by the way, this video, literally the description is comedy for your Friday. It does not actually, it claims to be a fact-checking video. That does not, in fact, cite its sources for you to check out for yourself, okay? It doesn't do that. All right.
Will destroy the suburbs, whipping up violence and intimidation.
Here we have
And
the Target being looted. You know, the official symbol of America, Target, being viciously looted. Okay.
and they're pinning it all on
Look at these burning cars. The destruction of property. So violent.
what's been an overwhelmingly peaceful.
Also, boss, immigrants are not mostly poor. Your perception of that is likely due to the fact that there are a lot of undocumented immigrants who come here who are poor. If they're able to come here legally, generally it's because they have money.
Movement for racial.
This was a pretty big fire. That impressive. Impressive. Also, disclaimer here for the chuds who will come eventually. Rioting is bad, and destruction of property is also bad, and I condemn both of those things. But also, I condemn the social, environment, the social forces that lead to people rioting. Because here's a pro tip for you. People don't riot when their lives are going well, okay? They don't riot when they're being treated in a good fashion, right? It's just not something that people tend to do unless they're white and their favorite sports team either won or lost the big game, you know? Then I just need to clarify, do not support rioting, but I do support peaceful demonstrations, okay?
Solidarity. It's true. Research backs it up. Only a tiny fraction of demonstrations
More
have
than
had
700 officers injured in George Floyd protests across the United States. So I got about this far when I was watching the video before, and I got really curious as to A, how this number was come up with, and B, how many protesters had been injured by police during the protests. Yes, true. It is from the New York Post, a very disreputable source. However, I looked online and could not find even a rough estimate of the number of protesters harmed during the protests, which indicates to me that it is an incredibly large number. And the reason I say it indicates to me that it is an incredibly large number is because the Black Lives Matter protests for Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, those were the largest protests in the history of the United States. In the history of the United States. Almost 30 million people participated in those. The fact that it's only 700 officers being injured is actually a pretty good considering there were millions of protesters on the streets. But it does make me wonder how many of those protesters were injured badly. So, here's what I found. My faith in the world is gone. For protesters injured by police, there's no real recovery. From Time magazine. Ellen Urbani shook her head in disbelief as she scanned the cobwebbed shelves of her suburban garage looking for items that might protect her at a Black Lives Matter protest. This is absurd, she thought. I can't believe I let people talk me into thinking I need this stuff. She dusted off her son's snowboard helmet and hooked it onto a backpack that held her daughter's swim goggles, her asthma respirator, and a change of clothes in case the long yellow-sleeved V-neck she was wearing burned off from chemical gas. She scribbled her husband's name and phone number on her thigh in permanent marker in the event she became incapacitated. With her auburn hair braided into pigtails, the 51-year-old author then left the safety of her 43-acre farm outside of Portland, Oregon, on July 24th to link arms with hundreds of other mothers demanding justice for George Floyd. By midnight, Urbani says, federal agents had enveloped the protesters in clouds of gas, and flash grenades exploded. Projectiles as big as softballs began to fly. As the women around her choked and vomited from the fumes and as bodies began crashing into each other, Urbani reminded herself that she's just a mom, a law-abiding former Peace Corps volunteer, and a threat to no one. Then I felt my bone break, she said. It felt like being hit by a 90-mile-per-hour baseball. So I need to remind you that oftentimes cops will be like, they were throwing rocks and bottles at us, as they stand behind riot shields that deflect the rocks and bottles. Alternatively, they are able to lift a gun, shoot a 90-mile-per-hour projectile into moms who are peacefully protesting, and break their bones. While taking part in the largest sustained social justice mobilization in modern U.S. history, dozens of people have been beaten with batons, hit by cars, doused by pepper spray, and critically wounded by rubber bullets, beanbag rounds, and other police weapons. More than just a general reminder, rubber bullets are not actually made out of rubber. They are actual bullets coated in a light coating of rubber. They are designed to be shot at the ground to bounce up and hit people. However, how they've been used in these protests has been as bullets would be used. So just shooting directly at protesters, which is how this woman got her eye shot out. Compared with other Black Lives Matter protesters injured by law enforcement, Urbani knows she's one of the luckier ones. Yeah. Even so, let's see, from May 26th to August 22nd, let's see, by the nonprofit Armed Conflict Location and Event Data. Okay. Even so, at least 115 protesters were shot in the head, face, and neck with various projectiles, including bullets and tear gas. It's from May 26th to July 27th. The nonprofit health advocacy group compiled its data from news and medical reports, because strangely, the police didn't take numbers when they were cracking skulls. And it's funny that there has only, from this report, 115 protesters got hurt. However, a conservative lawyer was very, very kind enough during the protests, even though I disagree with the general outlook of this particular person, was very kind enough to find video evidence of cops beating protesters, or shooting protesters, or otherwise abusing protesters. Let's see, seems pretty calm. Points at someone. Oh, and then they start going after protesters. Yep. Oh, look, they're on top of a guy there, beating him. This is one of 300, by the way. This guy stopped taking account at around 300, I believe. But If you want, I will put it in the description. You all can take a look at these pieces of video evidence for yourselves, come to a conclusion. Um, oh, look. Um, yeah. Apparently, the NYPD pepper sprayed a man to death in his cell. His name was Jamal Floyd. Say his name. Um, Interesting. Interesting how stuff like this just happens. Inmate death. Um, weird. Weird how all of this is somehow not accounted for in any of the stuff we see from the protests. Weird, huh? Anyway, I don't have time to go through all of these individually. But T. Greg Doucetti was able to find multiple angles of some of these and provide some pretty good video evidence for people to use. He also works as a criminal defense attorney, so he knows what to look for. Okay. Let's continue watching, shall we? What other things are the big brains at PragerU gonna bring up?
Violence at all.
Exclusive $1 billion plus riot damage is most expensive in insurance history. Interesting. Let's, you know what? Maybe we should take a look at, some fact checking, stuff here. Let's see. You know what? Let's take a look at Axios. Axios. $1 billion protest. Okay, here we go. Most expensive in U.S. insurance insurance history. The vandalism and looting following the death of George Floyd at the hands of the Minneapolis PD will cost the insurance industry more than any other violent demonstrations in recent history, Axios has learned. A company called Property Claim Services has tracked insurance claims related to civil disorder since 1950. It classifies anything over $25 million in insured losses as a catastrophe, and reports that the unrest from this year, May 26th to June 8th, will cost the insurance industry more than any prior one. The number could be as much as $2 billion, possibly more, according to the Insurance Information Institute, which compiles information from PCS as well as other firms that report such statistics. The protests, I guess I would be interested to know what a third party might say that is unrelated to the insurance industry. The protests related to George Floyd's death are so different because they're so widespread. This is still happening, so losses could be significantly more. Yes, but these losses are small compared with those stemming from natural disasters like hurricanes, wildfires that are consuming the U.S. West. Interesting. So the United States West has experienced wildfire season has cost about, let's see. 2019 numbers aren't available yet. Generally costs about $18 to $15 billion over the last couple years. So, maybe denying those places aid is a pretty big deal. Between the lines, PCS, a unit of Verisk Analytics, won't reveal an exact dollar figure from this year's violence because it wants to sell that data to clients, but it says the insured losses far outstrip the prior record of $775 million from the 1992 Rodney King demonstrations. I do need to point out that $775 million from Rodney King demonstrations in 1992 dollars, if you bring that up to 2020 dollars, it's roughly $1.4 billion for the Rodney King riots. So, saying, by the way, that $1 billion plus riot damage is most expensive is somewhat misleading, because the value of money in 1992 is different from the value of money in 2020. Just how it works. So it's possible that this is the most expensive riot damage in insurance history. It's also possible that it's not. It's also much larger than the Rodney King riots were back in 1992. Interesting. Interesting. Okay. Maybe this is why they don't post their sources in the in the description, so that you don't read the information provided and come to your own conclusions.
So what the president is doing.
Body found in Minneapolis building burned during George Floyd protests. Well, that's a shame. That's not good. I don't support that. Let's see. Let's take a look at it though. Body found in burned building during BLM protest. All right, here's the article. Minneapolis officers said the body was of a man in a building burned down during the protests. We are treating this death as a homicide. On Monday morning, officials from the Minneapolis Fire Department, along with agents from the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, went to a building on East Lake Street based on an anonymous tip, searched the burned rubble where Maxit Pond once stood, and found a deceased individual. The body appears to have suffered thermal injuries and was taken to Hennepin County Medical Examiner's Office. The victim's identity will be released along with the nature and cause of death, he said. Let's see. They filed an arson charge against a 25-year-old man after investigation into the fire of Maxit Pond where the body was found. Okay. Well, I wonder if there's an update on this story. Let's see. Body found. Oh, here we go. Identified whose body was found. Oscar Lee Stewart Jr. Well, that doesn't tell us about the. I want to know whether this person died in the fire. But either way, they caught the person who set the blaze, so I think that's a win, right? We caught the arsonist, guys. That's a good thing. It's a good thing.
Is once again patently false. It's morally wrong. And
wait, I just need to point out that, like, police, again, do not stop fatal shootings. Like, it's not like police show up, like, before a shooting happens to stop it. Like, that's not something that happens. Like, the shooting would have happened whether or not police were allowed inside of Seattle's CHOP protest zone. City officials have vowed to dismantle the free protest area set up during anti-police demonstrations and retake the Capitol Hill police station, but worries of confrontation have delayed a resolution. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure that these would have been stopped by having police in that area. But the perception that this video wants us to have is that these are somehow related to the protest, rather than the fact that they could be just crime happening because crime happens and is completely unrelated to protesters.
And yes, it is.
Retired St. Louis police captain killed after responding to a pawn shop alarm during looting. This was a sad story. He was trying to stop some looting from happening, and he got clocked in the head and died.
Is racist, but that doesn't mean it won't work. Because this is a difficult time, a confusing time.
Okay. Don't ever do this, but it did make me chuckle.
And when people hear these lies and crazy conspiracies repeated over and over and over again, they don't know what to think. With everything going on in their lives, they don't
Wait, did he
have
just get clocked
lives.
by another police officer?
With everything going on in their lives, they don't have time to fact-check falsehoods being spread throughout the internet.
Dang,
And
look,
even
look at that.
reasonable people might get scared.
Who knows what
And
might have been
one thing
happening
this
prior to
president
this?
is really, really good at is
Who
using
knows
fear
what might have been
and
happening
confusion
prior?
and spreading lies to win.
Dang. It's not like that has been a signature of U.S. protests for decades. So, interesting. Interesting facts that we have gleaned from this PragerU video. However, let's take a little look at something. Amnesty International has found that law enforcement violated Black Lives Matter protesters' human rights and documents acts of police violence and excessive force. Interesting. Amnesty International recorded 125 separate incidents of police violence against protesters, medics, journalists, and legal observers in 40 states and D.C. during May and June protests. Today, Amnesty International USA released a report documenting widespread and egregious human rights violations by police officers against protesters gathered to protest the unlawful killings of Black people by police and to call for systemic reform. Let's see. The report, The World is Watching, Mass Violations by U.S. Police of Black Lives Matter Protesters' Rights, builds on Amnesty's interactive mapping of violence against protesters and new findings on the use of lethal force by police. It is the most comprehensive human rights analysis of police violence against protesters to date. So let's take a look at this. Yeah, nine states in Washington, D.C. continue to lack state laws on the use of lethal force by law enforcement officers. Weird. 11 states still do not have laws that even comply with the lower standards set by U.S. constitutional standards on the use of lethal force by law enforcement officers. Only 3 states have made progress towards preventing the use of lethal force by police. Yeah, Black people represent 13.2% of the population, but they represent 24.2% of people shot and killed by police over the course of 2015 to 2019. Yeah. Oh, here's the interactive map. We can look at the different areas. We can view the event. Look at this.
These protesters are unarmed, and the police are shooting their little fun bullets at them. Look at it. Look at it. Coming out with their hands up.
Need to remind you, in the United States, it is not a crime to call a police officer a bitch-ass motherfucker. It's not. And it doesn't warrant a violent attack by police, especially if you're standing in the open in broad daylight with your hands up, lawfully protesting.
Don't shoot! Need double vote!
Yeah, so they just shot her. She is unable to walk.
She did nothing to you! She did nothing at all to you! You guys are fucking pigs! She did nothing! She had her hands up! What the fuck is wrong with you?
So anyway, yeah, Amnesty International has handily put together this interactive map where you can see literally incidents from all across the country and scroll through an alphabetical list by state of video evidence of police committing widespread and egregious human rights violations. Because apparently, I don't know if you guys know this, but police abusing their power as agents of the state to abuse, harm, and or maim people is actually an abuse of human rights. It's a human rights violation. They're literally committing like crimes. However, we don't hold police to the same standards we would other people. Yeah, breaking the bones of protesters who are legally protesting. Doesn't matter if you're a police officer, you know? I'll throw this up in the comments. This is a handy tool, okay? Also, let's take a look. There was a lot of misinformation about Black Lives Matter. About how, like, Black Lives Matter has killed 36 people, injured 1,000 police officers. Turns out, not true. No evidence of the toll from past protests against police brutality. We found no evidence that the toll from protests against police brutality is as high as the numbers in the post. The U.S. Justice Department told us it does not have numbers on officer injuries or property damage resulting from civil disturbances. Black Lives Matter protesters attract not only BLM members, but supporters and opponents, making it impossible to assign blame to BLM for particular incidents. So I do need to clarify that for a lot of the numbers being thrown around by like relating property damage to the protests, it's not exactly clear cut that the people perpetrating these crimes are in league with the protesters. In some cases, they might be. In other cases, they are definitely not. And in other cases, it's violence perpetrated by opponents like police officers or counter protesters like the Boogaloo Boys or the Proud Boys. So, if you don't believe me, here's a study released just a few days ago by Erica Chenoweth and Jeremy Pressman. It appeared in the Washington Post. It comes to us courtesy of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, a Harvard school. Basically, this is a crunch of the numbers. Let's take a look at what they found, shall we? When the Department of Homeland Security released its Homeland Threat Assessment earlier this month, it emphasized that self-proclaimed white supremacist groups are the most dangerous threat to U.S. security. Hey, we covered that. How about that? But the report misleadingly added that there have been over 100 days of violence and destruction in our cities, referring to the anti-racism uprisings of this past summer. In fact, the Black Lives Matter uprisings were remarkably non-violent. When there was violence, very often police or counter-protesters were reportedly directing it at the protesters. Since 2017, we have been collecting data on political crowds in the United States, including the protests that surged during the summer. We have almost finished collecting data from May to June, having already documented 7,305 events in thousands of towns and cities in all 50 states and DC, involving millions of attendees. Because most of the missing data are from small towns and cities, we do not expect the overall proportions to change significantly once we complete the data collection. We make two assumptions. First, when politicians and officials categorize the protests as violent, they're usually envisioning property destruction or interpersonal violence in which they infer that Black Lives Matter protests are attacking police, bystanders, and property. Second, using several measures to evaluate protest behavior offers a better assessment than the blanket term violence. For example, we disaggregate property destruction from interpersonal violence, because those are two different things that we should measure differently. We analyze separately the number of injuries or deaths among protesters and police, and we are thinking about how gathering even finer-grained data in the future could help assign precise responsibility for violent acts. Here's what we found based on the 7,305 events we've collected. The overall levels of violence and property destruction were low, and most of the violence that did take place was, in fact, directed against the BLM protesters. First, police made arrests in 5% of the protest events. And remember, this is of 7,305. So 5% of those events had arrests being made. Over 8,500 reported arrests, or possibly more. I'm going to lean towards more, because this is just the number of arrests reported. Many more people were detained and then released without being arrested. Police used tear gas or related chemical substances in 2.5% of these events. Protesters or bystanders were reportedly injured in 1.6% of the protests. In total, at least 3 Black Lives Matter protesters and 1 other person was killed while protesting in Omaha, Austin, and Kenosha, Wisconsin. 1 anti-fascist protester killed a far-right group member during a confrontation in Portland, Oregon. Law enforcement killed the alleged assailant several days later. We covered that yesterday, actually. And also, worth noting, law enforcement assassinated the alleged assailant several days later, refusing to identify themselves in unmarked vehicles, and witnesses said they stepped out of their car and immediately started firing, even before civilians were clear of the area. But, whatever. Police were reported injured in 1% of the protests, which you'll notice is less than 1.6% of the protests. Weird how that happens. A law enforcement officer killed in California was allegedly shot by supporters of the far-right Boogaloo movement, not anti-racism protesters. True. We talked about that briefly a while ago, actually. The killings in the line of duty of other law enforcement officers during this period are not related to the protests. Only 3.7% of the protests involved property damage or vandalism. Some portion of these involved neither police nor protesters, but people engaging in vandalism or looting alongside the protests. In short, our data suggests that 96.3% of events involved no property damage or police injuries, and 97.7% of events, no injuries were reported among participants, bystanders, or police. I just want to let that soak in for a minute. 97.7% of these historic protests were nonviolent, in which no participants, bystanders, or police, or property were damaged in any way. So the idea that this video propagates is that we should be paying attention to in the midst of a historic moment where more people than ever before are taking to the streets to argue that we'll get to that Shadows of the Earth. I'm more than happy to talk about that. But in the midst of a historic time for the battle for racial equity, and the battle against systemic racism and bias in our country, this video asks you to pay attention to less than 3% of the protests. To have this picture of them as cities being burned to the ground, when the reality is 97.7% of these events, no injuries were reported among participants, bystanders, or police. In 97.7%. In the largest demonstrations the public has done, possibly in American history, or at the very least on the same equivalent as the civil rights movement days. The fact that these have been so peaceful is actually astonishing, especially given that the narrative has been from all sides of the media focusing on the violence. And I need to be clear here. The violence isn't good when it comes from protesters or police. The issue here, though, is that police should be held to a higher standard. Like, that's why this map, where we can click and view individual on-camera instances of police misconduct and violation of human rights and laws, is such a big deal, because police officers have the power to kill and injure us and need to be held to account when they do so. They should be able to justify why they are committing violence against the citizens that they are sworn to protect and serve. Ninja Tuna, the U.S. police officers are trained to be scared, but they should be trained for the consequences of using lethal force, as they should be investigated every time they use lethal force. Exactly. I think it's a really big no-brainer that if police use lethal force, they should be investigated by an independent third party that is not the state or local prosecutors, that they have to work with in order to, put criminals behind bars. It's really, really easy to look at this video if you don't know anything about what's going on, and come away with the idea that Democrats are, for some reason, lying about these protests being mostly peaceful, despite the fact that the data that exists on these events shows us that it is incredibly peaceful when it comes to the history of protest movements. Let me just take a quick look here. God damn it. Yeah, I mean, like, guys, let's not try and sugarcoat this. Like, if we look back at history, it's only peaceful in retrospect. Dr. Martin Luther King was arrested 30 times, beaten, was stalked, assassinated, and was hated during his time. Okay? Like, hated. The idea that he was a peaceful leader is largely a historical reading that he largely earned by emphasizing the need for peaceful protest. However, the idea that he and his protesters were met with peaceful sentiment from the officers or communities that they were protesting in is laughable. So it's these protests are continuing in the proud tradition of Martin Luther King Jr. of being incredibly overwhelmingly peaceful events on the part of the protesters, while being met with human rights abuses by the state, by the police, the agents of the state, and sacrificing their bodies for this movement, for this cause. They're getting cannons shot at them on a nightly basis. Look at this. Look at that injury. It is continuing in the tradition of Martin Luther King Jr. to also have this protest in its time called a violent protest, for the effects around it. However, I think we should be proactive in how we place this protest, because if the data is saying that it was a mostly peaceful protest, and by mostly peaceful, like 2.3% of events were not peaceful, maybe, just maybe, we should trust the data over whatever narrative that we are consuming here. True, I have a lot of vets in my chat. It turns out being in the military radicalizes a lot of people. uh, but yeah. So I guess newsflash: PragerU is disgustingly dishonest with its presentation of facts and how it chooses to select stories to highlight for its narrative.